Hey, this is Gaming Bench. Welcome back. Today I'm looking at Dragon Age the Veilguard, and I've got a lot to say. This is a long video. There are jump codes in the description. Please check those out if you just want to skip to, say, 1080p Ultra or 1440p Ultra or upscaling or whatever it is you're looking for. But I want to tell you a little bit about testing while I run these videos in the background. You can see the FPS in the top left corner of each segment, and the cards are basically matched up on pricing. So 3058 gigabyte RX 6600, they cost around $200. The next step up, the cards cost around $300, then $500, $550, $1,000, maybe $800 on the AMD side for the 7900 XTX. And at the top, we have the RTX 4090 that costs, I don't know, $1,600, $1,800, $2,000. It kind of depends on the day of the month. That card seems like it's being phased out, and so the next generation has room to breathe, so to speak. And so there's no more inventory being produced of the 4090. Prices are going up. But that's all beside the point. What I want to talk about here is how I test and why I test and what I'm after. So first off, I am trying to be independent and unbiased as possible. I might talk about game engines and whether they are running well or poorly or whatever. That's not the reason I'm doing this, but it is just to show things. I want to look at a bunch of games and show how they run. Second, I am not like in favor of AMD or in favor of Nvidia or in favor of Intel. I can test all of those graphics cards. I can use different CPUs. Right now I have an Intel Core i9 13900K. It's one of the fastest CPUs for gaming. Technically, AMD's Ryzen 7 7800X3D is a little bit faster. Does it matter at 1440p and 4K? Probably not. I am looking at upgrading to a Ryzen 7 9800X3D though, just because 5090 is coming out and I need to remove the bottlenecks. The other thing I'm doing is testing basically stock cards. I'm not looking for overclocked cards. I'm not overclocking the CPU. The only thing I do on the CPU is I enable XMP memory so that the memory is running at DDR5 5600 speed with CAS latency of 28. I believe this is 283232 memory from G.Skill. It might be 283434. Not super important, but if you turn on XMP, it sets all that stuff up in the BIOS for the memory, and you get a little bit more performance. It's not really overclocking. Some might say it's kind of overclocking, but it doesn't affect CPU speeds. I am not going to disable P cores or E cores. I am not going to try undervolting or overvolting or underclocking or overclocking on the CPUs or the GPUs. These cards are out of the box configured to run as you would buy them, because that's how like 99.9% of people use their PCs. And I don't want to show the extreme, like this is what the super uber special people run. I just want to show what normal people can expect. As far as the graphics cards, there are links to cards you can buy on Amazon that supports my channel. You don't need to click through to those if you don't want to, but those are just links to the GPU in general. The difference between the fastest and slowest version of any particular GPU is going to be pretty slim. Let me pause here and talk about the chart. 4090 at the top, tied with the 7900 XTX at 179 FPS, but with better minimum FPS. And then the 4080 Super is a little bit behind that. This is pretty typical of 1080p medium on ultra high-end cards. AMD's drivers just seem to have a little bit more leg room on the 13900K. I don't know if it applies on all CPUs. I haven't checked all CPUs. 7900 GRE beats the 4070. 7600 XT beats the 4060. That is unusual for 1080p medium because normally Nvidia is faster. And then at the bottom, 6600 beats the 3050 8GB card, and that is not unusual. So that's the standings for 1080p medium. We're moving on to 1080p Ultra. No upscaling. We'll start with the budget cards again, the 3050 and the 6600, and move on up while I go back to what I was talking about. Not overclocking, not trying to make any CPU or GPU look better than what most people get. If you buy an RTX 3050 or an RX 6600 or a 4090 or a 4080 or whatever GPU we're talking about, and you can get it from Asus, you can get it from MSI, Gigabyte, XFX, Sapphire, Power Color, you name it. The difference between the fastest and the slowest version of any particular GPU tends to be on the order of maybe 5%. And there's variability, so I think it's more like 3% in most cases, except for super extreme overclock cards might have a little bit more oomph. Nearly all GPUs use reference clocked memory. Almost nobody ever overclocks the memory by default, whether it's GDDR5 or GDDR6 or GDDR6X. They just don't do it. I don't know if that's AMD and Nvidia not letting the manufacturers do that, or if it's just for stability purposes. And that's why I don't overclock. I don't want to try and show better performance than people will get, but then have crashes or encourage people to do something that will cause crashes. Overclocking used to be a big deal back in the day, but now almost everything is pushing the limit as hard as it can while maintaining stability. And yeah, there's still maybe 5-10% of leeway that you could squeak out a little bit extra. And some people still have fun doing that. And I'm not saying you can't do it. But personally, I don't bother with it anymore just because it's not worth the time and effort for just a few percent more. Not for me anyway. I had a Celeron 300A back in the day, if you know what those were, right? I had Pentiums before that. Pentium MMX. I overclocked a Pentium MMX from 200 to 250 megahertz. That is a 25% overclock. I overclocked the Celeron 300A from 300 megahertz to 450 megahertz. I think I even had one chip that did 512 megahertz or something. It was a lot. 50% overclocks were a huge deal back in the day. That was amazing. 5% overclock? Yeah, it's fine. Go ahead and do it if you want, but let's not write home about it and tell everyone how awesome it is because it really doesn't make that much of a difference. Okay, that's my background. I'm not trying to make any manufacturer look good or bad. I'm just showing how they run the games. Games do change over time. Drivers change over time. This is a snapshot in time. It will always be that. So this is on November 12th that I'm recording this. And this is how Dragon Age the Veilguard ran over the past couple of days of testing while I ran all these benchmarks. I'm using AMD's 24.10.1 drivers. I'm using Nvidia's, oh shoot, there's so many, 566.03 or some such. Whatever came out near the end of October, that's what I'm using. New drivers did just drop. I'm not using the absolute latest drivers because I was done with testing before those came out. 1080p Ultra performance. Here, the 4090 takes the top spot. Not too far ahead of the 4080 Super though, so that means we're hitting CPU bottlenecks. 7900 XT falls off the pace. Interesting. The 7900 GRE still beats the 4070, not by as much as we would normally see. 7600 XT beats the 4060. Again, that's kind of interesting because the 4060 often has more compute and performance. This is an Nvidia promoted as well. Dragon Age the Veilguard is an Nvidia promoted game. That's why it's got DLSS 3 frame generation, but not FSR2 frame generation. I mean, maybe that's not why it has that, but it had to have DLSS 3 to be Nvidia promoted is what it amounts to. And the 6600 and 3050 on that chart, they're down at the bottom. They're kind of borderline playable. I'm not going to show any more videos of those bottom cards because they're too slow and choppy. Even the 4060 and 7600 XT are struggling a bit here at 1440p Ultra, although the 4060 is struggling way worse than the 7600 XT. But part of this, I believe, is when I captured video while running this segment on the 4060, it reached like the critical mass where it's like, oh, you're doing too much. And so it dropped performance while I was recording video. So the chart will show when I'm not recording video and performance was better. The 7600 XT was still faster. Here we have the RTX 4070 and 7900 GRE at 1440p Ultra. And AMD's card usually is faster. Unless you enable ray tracing, then sometimes it's slower. It depends on how much ray tracing there is and how the game implements it. Veilguard does have ray tracing support. If you use the default Ultra setting, it has selective ray tracing. I just turned that off because I didn't want to worry about whether that was influencing scores at all. I want to show pure rasterization. I will look at ray tracing performance at 4K at the end, and I will turn on all the ray tracing. I won't do selective, I'll do everything. It doesn't actually drop performance that much compared to a lot of games we've seen. It also doesn't change the visuals that much. So you could definitely play this game without ray tracing. The one thing that ray tracing does noticeably impact in terms of visuals is the water, and I will show that later. You can see the halo around the character as you run by that lake there. That was screen space reflections and other things, screen space calculations that are happening with the water that interferes because screen space isn't perfect and ray tracing does better. So we'll look at that later. RTX 4090 and 7900 XTX, obviously these are not competitors in terms of price. The 4090 costs about double what the XTX costs these days. But it's the fastest Nvidia card, it's the fastest AMD card for now. Probably getting 5090 and 5080 at the start of 2025. And we'll probably get, I don't know if it's going to be called 8900 XTX or something else. It's all up in the air. One thing I do want to say, I didn't get to this earlier. I use reference cards pretty much where possible. So RTX 4090 Founders Edition, 4080 Founders Edition, 4080 Super Founders Edition, 4070 Founders Edition. Let's quickly go through the chart here. Almost a 20% lead for the 4090 over the 4080 Super. So we're leaving the CPU bottlenecks behind, but not entirely, because the 4090 is about 30% faster if you're not CPU limited. 4080 Super beats the 7900 XTX. The GRE beats the 4070. 7600 XT still beating the 4060. Minimums on the 4060 drop even worse. And then the 6600 and 3050, they aren't really playable at native at 1440p. You could turn on upscaling and that would help. Probably get closer to what you saw at 1080p in terms of performance with a little bit better visuals overall. 4K Ultra, no ray tracing, no upscaling. This is going to be a struggle on a lot of the cards. And the 4060 here getting into the low 20s, dropping below 20 at times. 7600 XT running a little faster. I was talking about this earlier, ray tracing on the water. You can see the halo around the rocks and the character and some other stuff that's caused by screen space reflections. This is the most demanding part of my benchmark run. That's something else I can talk about. Why did I test here? This is, I don't even know the name of this level. I've played the game a little bit, got to this point. What I was looking for is how well the game was running and a segment that I could run without getting interrupted by like a cutscene or something else happening. And so after playing through the first, I don't know, hour or two of the game, I'd been watching frame rates and the game opened up a little bit here and I had a nice loop that I could run. And so that's what I selected. It looked more demanding than some of the areas I'd played through earlier. So there are parts of the game that will probably run 50% faster than this. There are probably parts of the game that will run worse than this, like a big city or something later in the game. I don't know. But this segment, walking down that like tree-lined path, you'll see performance on both cards usually drops quite a bit right there. And then as we get to the more open areas, it speeds back up. All right, 4080 Super, 7900 XTX. We are running at nearly 80 frames per second with dips below 60. If you're not recording video, performance tends to be a little bit better. Keep that in mind. I am recording video for the captures, so that impacts the green real-time frame rates in the corners, but it does not necessarily reflect how the game will always look or run or whatever you want to say it. Usually it's only about a 5% hit. 4060, as I mentioned, on 1440p, or I think, yeah, is on 1440p Ultra. The 4060 choked there. Probably would have choked even worse at 4K. It could only do so much before like memory bandwidth and other things come into play. 4090, 7900 XT, of course the 4090 is going to be faster now. We are in a game that is pushing the GPU pretty hard. Without GPU bottlenecks, it looks like the CPU could run this in the 140 frames per second range, something like that. We're well below that mark now, indicating that the GPU is the limiting factor. And the 4090 has a lot of memory bandwidth, it has a lot of compute, it has something like 60% or 50% more compute than the 7900 XTX. It's a pretty big gap. And this is Nvidia promoted game, so maybe there's some benefits there. Overall scores, now we got 82 versus 65 for the top two Nvidia cards, a bigger gap there. The XTX is closing the gap with the 4080 Super, however, because memory bandwidth starts to become a factor, and you've got 24 gigabytes and a 384-bit bus versus 16 gigabytes on Nvidia with a 256-bit bus. GRE also has more memory and more bandwidth than the 4070. That's part of why it's generally doing better. And then the 7600 XT and 4060, they both have about the same memory bandwidth, but the 7600 XT has twice as much VRAM. Doesn't really seem to be hitting VRAM limitations in terms of capacity, but it is what it is. Now, let's turn on ray tracing. Woo! Everybody loves ray tracing. No, they don't. Ray tracing in this game, it does ray traced reflections and ray traced ambient occlusion. So some of the shadows you see in the corners and stuff are done via ray tracing calculations to make them look a little bit more realistic. And when I say a little bit more, I really do mean that. It's a very small difference on the shadows. In fact, I would just as soon not have game developers worry about this if it's not going to make a bigger difference. but we'll see. Ray tracing is probably the path forward, but right now it's not that necessary. And because of ray tracing being enabled, the 4070 and the 7900 GRE are now much closer in performance. Ray tracing impacts Nvidia GPUs typically less than AMD because Nvidia has better ray tracing hardware is what it comes down to. And we see that with the 4080 Super and the RX 7900 XTX as well. They were pretty close without ray tracing. Now the 4080 Super is running maybe 20% faster. I don't know. I can't do the math on the fly, but it definitely is running faster than the 7900 XTX with ray tracing enabled. The water that you briefly saw back there at the lake, that has a difference with ray tracing on. Everything else looks so similar that it's hardly worth even talking about or worrying about. And then, of course, finally, we have the 4090 versus XTX, and Nvidia is getting just about 60 frames per second, give or take. Minimum's dropping below that. A little bit of micro stutter or whatever. It's not super noticeable. So it's about 50 to 60% faster than AMD's fastest card now with ray tracing. This is still running native though. So next up, after the charts, I will turn on upscaling. So we'll have quality mode upscaling on both cards, and we'll see how performance changes. And basically 4K with quality mode upscaling is the same more or less as 1440p native, but some overhead for upscaling. 4090 clearly ahead now. 4080 Super clearly ahead of the XTX. The 4070 tied basically with the GRE, worst minimums. 7600 XT and 4060 really not handling ray tracing very well at all, but let's see what they can do with upscaling, right? This is the pretty typical standings for a game with ray tracing enabled, but upscaling is almost required if you're going to try doing ray tracing, especially at 4K. So let's go ahead and turn on quality mode upscaling. DLSS 3 and FSR2. Not that DLSS 3 and 2 matters, but FSR2 and 3 does matter because you don't get frame generation with FSR2. And I don't know what the quality of the upscaling is. 3 does have some improvements for the upscaling algorithm, I believe. They're a little harder to spot. FSR does not look as good as DLSS in terms of the quality overall. It looks a little fuzzier and blurrier. Keep that in mind. 4070 and 7900 GRE, we're back to the GRE having a relatively small performance advantage overall, I think. They're pretty comparable, getting just over 30 frames per second. 4080 Super and 7900 XTX, they do a lot better with upscaling and 4K because now we're getting 60 frames per second, give or take, on the AMD card, and over 70 frames per second on the RTX 4080 Super. And I do have some frame generation results at the end. There is no frame generation on AMD, at least not right now, so I'm not going to try and compare AMD versus Nvidia, one with frame gen, one without. That's where I talk about bias. So Nvidia, if you ever go to their site and you look at their benchmark results, they're like, hey, look at how great we are. And they don't show AMD cards. There's probably some legal ramifications for showing your competitors' cards, so they don't really do that very much. They just run all their benchmarks on RTX cards with FrameGen enabled. They show native and then they show upscaling, usually in performance mode at 4K. So you're running 1080p upscaling to 4K. I'm using quality mode, so it's rendering 1440p and upscaling to 4K. Big difference. It looks better. You can still do 1080p to 4K and it looks all right though. I will say that. Like, it's not the end of the world. But then, so you do performance mode upscaling, 4x upscaling, and then you do frame generation on top of that, and you can get a pretty big boost in performance. But frame gen doesn't help performance nearly as much as you see in some games. Anyway, I'll get to that in a moment. 85 versus 69 on the top Nvidia cards, and that's a pretty big gap. 69 versus 58 for the 4080 Super and 7900 XTX. But then the GRE is slightly ahead of the 4070, and the 7600 XT easily beats the 4060 because the 4060 ran out of VRAM. Even though you have DLSS upscaling at 1440p, DLSS upscaling does require extra memory for the buffers, and at 4K, I guess that just proves a little bit too much for the 8 gigabytes of VRAM. That's why 8 gigabyte cards kind of suck these days, and I would not buy one. Unless you really know what you're getting into, don't buy an 8 gigabyte card. Alright, this is with frame generation enabled. So now the 4070, hey, it's getting close to 60 frames per second, not quite there. Frame generation in this game for Nvidia cards, it generally works well. From what I experienced, I ran around a bit, I played it. I would definitely turn it on and not be upset. input lag is there. It's a little bit worse latency on your input, but this isn't a shooter, so it doesn't really matter that there's a little bit more latency. And you can see there, the frame rate dropped to below 50. That means input frame rate of 25, right? That's not great. 4080 Super now getting way above 60. We're at 90-ish frames per second for this part. I think it drops down to minimums of around 70 or so. So that's a great experience. And 70 frames per second with framegen means 35 frames per second rendered and input latency. And for an RPG like this, that's fine. That's my opinion, but I think you can totally play RPGs and games like this with frame generation and get 60-ish frames per second, and it's not going to be a bad experience. That's not the case with every game. It varies by game. It also varies between AMD and Nvidia framegen. Finally, we have the RTX 4090. All the bells and whistles, running along slicker than snot. If you have a 144 Hz 4K or a 165 Hz or a 240 Hz 4K monitor, which is what I'm currently using, this is great. You will not get above 60 frames per second, generally speaking, at 4K native without frame generation and without upscaling. Maybe on the 5090 that will be a thing. Maybe with frame generation on a 5090 we might even be able to push 4K and 240 Hz with variable refresh rate. That'd be great. All right, here's the max settings, everything enabled, plus upscaling and framegen. The 4060 just totally choked. Couldn't do it all, not enough VRAM. But then the 4070, looking good. 4080 Super, doing excellent. 94 FPS and 117 FPS on the 4090. So, definitely playable. Would love to see FSR 3.1 get implemented in Dragon Age the Veilguard so that AMD users and even Intel and Nvidia users that don't have a 40 series card could also benefit from frame generation, potentially. It might not be perfect. All right, now let's talk ray tracing. So I got a few ways I want to look at this. First, this is just side by side. It's running on the 7900 XTX just because that's what I had at the time. All that water does a lot of reflections, and that really punishes the AMD card here. Did you see those fish? Oh, they jumped around the same time. They did not look the same on their reflections. The reflections in general, I mean, some people will even say, hey, I prefer the non-ray traced reflections. Those look fine. But the fish, you'll see, has some little graphics anomalies. And it's less accurate, but is it better or worse? I don't know. Oh, here you go. Watch the fish. See all that screen space reflection nonsense without ray tracing? That blur, that's where screen space reflections breaks down. And so that's why it looks better. Then we've got, finally, we're showing the same view and we'll just wipe back and forth. The people do move around a little bit, so they're not perfectly stationary, but you can see nothing else changes. So that's ray tracing. The water and the reflections look better with ray tracing, I would say. I don't think it's massively better, and there's not like a ton of water in this game, so having the benefits of ray tracing on water isn't going to matter to most people that much. Here's a different view though, no water. Still got ray traced ambient occlusion, right? Can you tell the difference between these scenes? I would be hard pressed. And you'll see that now where it was like almost a 1/3 performance on the RX 7900 XTX where there was water. Here we're only seeing maybe a 33% performance drop. So 33% is a lot better than 66% performance hit. Now let's wipe back and forth between them, kind of like Nvidia does, and you'll see, like, as you watch, you go, wow, how much really changes? A little, maybe. Is it clearly better with ray tracing or worse with ray tracing? That is difficult to say, and this is why I'm like, hey, the shadow ray tracing effects, not important. That's it. A lot of stuff said and covered. I hope you enjoyed that. Please like, share, and subscribe. Really, I want to get to the point where my YouTube channel can be monetized, so subscribing will get me there. It really does help people. Thank you. I've got some other games I'm looking forward to seeing next week. Microsoft Flight Simulator and Stalker 2. Woohoo! Take care. We'll see you next time.